Hi and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, no matter what it is you're doing. Have I ever told you how much I love rings? Buying them, wearing them, making them? How about together we make some really simple squiggle rings? I'm just going to be using 1mm or 18 gauge wire for the main body and a scrap of 0.5 or 24 gauge wire to secure an optional bead. Let's head down to the board and make this simple project together. So I have some samples of my simple squiggle ring here. I have one which is just a wraparound multi-size ring with no bead, and then I have two examples, a large one and a small one with beads set into them. We're going to learn the basic squiggling technique first, and then we'll come on to setting those beads later as an option if you want to. So this can be sized up to use a 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire. I'm working in an 18 gauge or 1mm wire because it's accessible for absolute beginners. Now you don't have to work hard in this ever so much, because as we're doing all those twists and turns, the wire does receive some work hardening from the bend that you're creating. However, if you did want to wear that as an everyday ring, you probably would want to take that up to a slightly heavier gauge. So there's a super large example of the squiggle ring, and that's what we're going to make. It's surprisingly comfortable, actually. Let's have a look at how we're going to create that. So your basic tools today are flush cutters. I'm going to use my bent chain nose pliers, and also a 2-step bail maker. Now mine is marked with a 6mm and a 4mm post. This is the most useful size to work with for this design. However, it can be achieved whilst using your multi-step bail makers. Let's start by conditioning our wire. I have 10 inches of 18 gauge or 1mm wire. And I find it's always best to start with more wire than you need. Even the teeny tiny ring took 6 inches of wire to generate enough squiggle to fit approximately a UK size K to L. So I've warmed that wire through nicely, and what we're going to do is start off by making a large loop on the end of that wire. So I'm going to use the 6mm side of my bail makers and just allow that cut end to sit against the inside of the swoop coming away towards the long tail. So if you want to, you can just tighten that up slightly so that the end sits in a little bit. And what we're then going to do is strengthen this loop. Because this is the only single loop on the design, all the others have a double loop, it's a little bit weaker. And what I want to do is to make sure that it's absolutely strong enough to maintain setting a bead if you so desire later on in the second part of this tutorial. So I've given that a really hearty squish, a good squish and a squeeze. What I'm going to do now is put the small side of my dual-sided bail makers into that larger aperture and just rotate those pliers around so that you get this figure of 8 section. And this is going to be the enduring part of today's tutorial. We're going to be making a series of figure of 8s, just again tightening up and strengthening that first section. The key to this technique is also to allow your wire to wrap around once over the top and once underneath, and that keeps the profile as low as possible. In this design there is wire crossing over itself, so you can't hammer it to strengthen it, and you can't prevent it from having just a little bit of extra depth. It's going to be at least 2mm thick in this instance with that 1mm gauge wire, because you've got a 1mm gauge on top of another 1mm gauge. So just bear that in mind when you're running your loops, and I'm going to show you how to start doing that looping, squiggling section now. I'm going to take the 4mm prong of my bail making pliers and put it into the large loop down at the base of my design. And I'm going to bring that wire all the way around. What I'll do is I'll just take that out for a second so you can see what's happening. I'm creating a small loop down at the base inside the large loop. What I want to do is take that wire all the way around so that it continues on. So we've made this figure of 8 shape, and then we've made an additional small loop inside the large loop and continued on in the same direction. What I want to do now is bring the wire back around on itself. So I'm going to put my small side of those bail makers back inside the design and then draw the wire back around underneath, so it's changed direction now. we've come along, made a smaller loop, and then switch like a figure of 8 to go back up. Now when we're making that figure of 8, we're only ever completing around about 2/3 of that second or lower 8 shape, the lowest little loop there. We're only completing around about 2/3 of that. What we will then do is put the small side back in. Now because my wire looped underneath, this time I want it to loop over the top. So we're always switching from underneath to over the top, drawing that wire around to create a small loop inside that large loop. I just want that to be as flat as possible down at the base so that the one wire sits on top of the other wire and we get that second little squiggle. So small loop inside a large loop, give that a little bit of a smooth and a warm, and then find the best hand position for yourself. I'm going to put my bail makers back inside, so the small side goes inside the small loop and the large side comes around and makes that squiggle shape 2/3 of the way around the lower segment. So you've got little snowmen or little squiggles and loops just recurring. It's the same design, just changing direction all the time. So let's put the small tine or the small prong back in. Now my wire has come over the top, so this time I want it to go underneath. I'm going to rotate the pliers around and just bring that wire all the way across at the base. I'm going to show that to you on camera now. So taking the prongs in and out of the loops multiple times is how this squiggle builds up. Just as a reference, this is 6 inches of wire, and that compressed down using my 4 and 6 millimeter pliers to generate a 1 3/4 inch length of wire. So as a reference, if I was to put that around a ring mandrel, that makes up for a very, very small ring as it is. So you can see that that doesn't entirely enclose even the diggiest finger. So that was 6 inches of wire. We're working with 10 inches of wire. What I'm going to do is show you one more time on camera, and then I'll take a break and just finish off squiggling the remainder of my 10-inch length. So we'll pop the smaller side of the bail makers into that loop that we've created, rotate the wire around to generate 2/3 of that lower 8, or the lower half of a snowman's body. And then we're going to switch that out to the smaller side of the bail making pliers and draw the wire all the way around. Now if you go slightly too wide, you can just rotate that so that it sits correctly. When you're making the small loop inside the large loop, you must ensure that the wire continues on as if it hadn't made that loop at all. So you can see we're going all the way around this loopy shape, little small loop, and then off it goes. It must be nice and flat like so. I'm going to continue with the remainder of this wire now, and then I'll rejoin you in a second and show you how much wire squiggle we've generated from that 10-inch length. So I've continued in exactly the same fashion, making a small loop inside that lower large loop, and we have now a length of squiggle with one end which is a large loop, and finishing off with a small loop inside a large loop at the other end. This measures 2 3/4 inches, and that is measured down from 10 inches. So that should give you some kind of idea of the ratio. We're probably getting around about 30% of the distance, give or take a little bit. It's not an exact science if you're me, because it's maths. Let's head down to the board and turn this in a ring together and see just how big that ring can fit from 10 inches of wire. So we have our 2 3/4 inch length of wire squiggle, and what I like to do is just ensure that everything is flat where I want it to be flat. So we finished with a large coil shape with a smaller little loop inside it, not a coil, sorry, a loop. And I'm just going to make sure that that's good and strong, and very, very gently I'm just going to compress down anywhere the wire is lifting. So you don't want to press very hard because you will end up weakening the design, and that would be a tragedy. So I've got the wire squiggle, and I've just taken a second to see if it's straight. I'm using the straight line on my board just here. I'm quite happy with that overall. So let's see what that 10-inch length of wire afforded us in terms of ring size. So let's just wrap around. That's a little bit small. So that's actually quite a large ring by the looks of things. I have a stick with some measurements on it. I think it's a US ring stick, so we'll have a look at the sizes that comes up to. Gorgeous purple from my pals at Beadalon. So that 10-inch length made approximately a size 10 ring. That's quite large. So that's more than plenty. What you can do, if that's more than you need, is trim that down. You do still need, if you're planning to add a bead into the design, you do still need to have one of those large loops without a small loop inside it. So what you can do is trim some of the length away. So what I'm going to do is hold my flush or semi-flush cutters just above where that last little coil of wire comes away. I'm just going to trim that. Gosh, that went very far. Squish that down and make that nice and strong, and then we'll measure to see what size ring we've made with one less loop. Just push that down onto your mandrel. I tend to use my wooden mandrel because it's a little bit more forgiving and I can push a little bit more warmth and intention into it whilst I'm at it. So what you can do is wrap the squiggle around the mandrel because it will slightly spring out. So let's have a look and see what size ring we've made with one less segment. That's taken that down to around about a 7 3/4. 7 3/4. I think a 7 is around about an O, something like that. So that's a fairly average ring size in the UK. What I would do then is just manually adjust that to fit and make sure that those ends are ever so slightly pushed in. Give that a bit of a squeeze until it sits by itself at the correct size. So if you do have any wires that lift up gently, you can very carefully encourage them to sit on the curve very, very softly. I'm not using any pressure at all. I'm just flattening that down so that I know that if I put that onto a finger, it's going to fit. So that's around about a size N on that finger, N to O, I would imagine. So if that's where you want to finish today's tutorial, you've made yourself a really easy squiggle ring. They're lots of fun. They don't take hardly any wire, and they certainly don't take much time. Once you get that rhythm going of using those two-stage bail makers, it's just sort of flipping them backwards and forwards a little bit, really. So if that is all for you, all is well and good, feel free to hang up. So that's your basic squiggle wraparound ring. However, if you wish to know how to set a bead into that and to join those two ends together, I'm going to show you how to do that now. So let's grab one of these rings and let's grab a bead. I'm working with a 4mm just off round faceted crystal from my good friends at Jessie James, and what I'm going to do is to set that inside the large 6mm loop that we made at the very beginning of the tutorial. So what I want to do is to start with my scrap length. This is approximately 3 inches of 0.5mm or 24 gauge wire, and I want to start winding that on the side of the large loop, which doesn't have a small loop inside it, but the side that's furthest away from the cut. So we've got the cut just on this side, so I want to wind on at least 4 times, I would say, with that wire around the section of loop furthest away from the cut end. So let's get that going. I'm going to lay the wire over the top. My finer gauge wire is laid over the top of the heavier loop, the loop that doesn't have the other smaller loop inside it. What I'm going to do is use my pliers to assist me to coil that around the section of looping heavier gauge wire. So this is much easier when you don't have to hold it still and far away from your face. You can hold this as close to your face as you like, but please do take care not to harm yourself. So I've got 4 loops running around there now. What I want to do is to have that tiny section of wire ending on the inside of the loop, not the inside of the ring. So I'm going to cut that just past. You can see a tiny sticky outy bit on the end there. And what I'm going to do is to rotate my pliers over that and tuck that end section up inside this circular looping form, and in that way it shouldn't come into contact with your finger at all. I'm going to compress that coil and make sure that everything is nice and safe and sound. I'm then going to introduce my bead. A round bead is ideal, but you can get away with a slightly off round. This is just ever so slightly larger than I would prefer to use. If that happens to you, you can either pick a slightly smaller bead or just open that loop up. What I'm going to do now is to, in one fell swoop, join the outer arch of that open side, the loop that didn't have the coil inside it, where we're setting that bead. I'm going to join that to the far end of the ring. So I'm going to just put a tiny bit of warmth through that finer gauge wire and drop the end down inside the small loop, inside the large loop at the other end of the ring. And I'm going to pull that all the way through, and then I'm going to bring the tail back up inside the large loop where we've set that bead. So we're just going to squish that up inside until that pops up, and then again you can use your pliers just to get some tension into that design. So we want the two ends of the squiggle ring to sit side by side, so you can just adjust that until they sit side by side. You don't want one on top of the other because it's uncomfortable in wear. What I'm going to do now is repeat that same process 3 times. So down inside the small loop inside the large loop, make sure that that's nice and neat and tidy. It's much better if you can get this all done in one move because it stresses your wire less, but that makes it hard for you to see what's happening. So I prefer to just break things down and make it blatantly obvious what is going on. I want you to be able to repeat these designs, not look at them and think, well, crikey, how did she do that? So I've squished very, very gently just to keep those 3 little wraps neat and tidy and side by side. And I'm going to finish off now with 4 wraps in just the small loop inside the large loop at the other end of the ring. So that's fairly dull to watch, but I am going to show you how that all happens. You can always fast forward me if you need to. So wrapping 4 times just around that small loop inside a large loop. Again, you can compress those coils for neatness. The neater your small coils of wire are, the less likely they are to come undone. So do take time to get them nice and tight and compressed. And again, on that 4th wrap, what I want to do is to have the wire truncate inside the loop itself, not inside the ring, but inside the loop. So I've just estimated where that wire will end. And then I'm going to give that a gentle compression, a gentle squeeze to set that into position. So I'm quite happy with my simple loopy ring. Once you get that rhythm going, they're fun to make, they're easy to make, and you can kind of production line them. You can get yourself loads of squiggle wire ready, and then make them according to the size and crystal or bead preference that your customers are looking for. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you've enjoyed my squiggle ring designs as much as I enjoy making them. They're fun, they're simple, they're relatively quick to make up. Have yourself a beautiful day, and I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon on the Gemhawks YouTube channel. Bye for now.